Maya Daniels had never been the kind of woman who waited for permission to take her place in a room, but she had spent her entire career walking into spaces where men, white, wealthy, and smug in their untouchable positions, looked at her like she was a guest who had wandered into a private dinner party rather than a professional who had earned her seat at the table, and today was no different as she entered the glass-walled boardroom of Caldwell Enterprises, a skyscraper-level chamber so polished it looked more like a museum of wealth than a workplace, with its long oak table gleaming under recessed lights and panoramic windows showing the city like a conquest spread out beneath them, and at the head of the table sat Harold Caldwell, the CEO whose name was etched on every letterhead and whose smirk was etched permanently on his face, a man who inherited more than he built, whose arrogance was thicker than his resume, and whose board of directors followed him not because he was brilliant but because his father had left him with power and they were too timid to challenge him. But Maya had not come here to be timid. She had come here to present a revolutionary expansion strategy that could rescue Caldwell Enterprises from the slow decline it was already suffering, though Harold was too proud to admit it, and as she laid out her laptop and prepared her notes, she could already hear the undercurrent of chuckles from the row of suited men along the side of the room, whispering like hyenas waiting for their leader to pounce, and pounce he did, leaning back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers behind his head, and saying in a voice dripping with sarcasm, "So, Miss Daniels, I hear you've got some big ideas for us. Why don't you dazzle us, Show us how it's done," as though the very idea of her contribution was a performance for his amusement, but Maya, tall and composed in her tailored navy suit, met his gaze without a flicker of hesitation, her dark eyes calm but sharp, and began to speak with the steady cadence of someone who had done her homework twice over, laying out an entry plan into global markets that Caldwell Enterprises had ignored. Markets teeming with potential clients, growing middle classes, and technological needs that their competitors were already preparing to exploit, and as she spoke, the air in the room shifted from casual dismissal to quiet attention because her words carried not only facts but authority, the kind of authority that could not be faked. Yet Harold wasn't interested in being educated, not by a woman like her, and certainly not in front of his board, so after a few minutes he interrupted with a laugh, cutting through her presentation like a knife, saying, "Tell you what, since you think you've got this all figured out, why don't you take my seat? Pretend you're the CEO. Show us all how you'd run this empire." His words met with the chuckles of his cronies who thought this was the punchline of the day, but what none of them expected was that Maya would not flinch, not giggle nervously, not decline politely. She simply walked around the table with unshakable grace, slid his chair back, and sat down as though it had always belonged to her, adjusting her posture with elegance before continuing her presentation from the head of the table, and in that instant the room changed, the laughter dying like smoke in the air, replaced with an uncomfortable silence as the men shifted in their seats, uncertain whether to continue mocking or to actually listen, and listen they did, because Maya began not just to present but to lead, guiding them through a detailed dissection of their failing divisions, their overlooked redundancies, and their lack of foresight, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she pulled up live projections, financial breakdowns, and competitor comparisons, her voice clear and commanding as she highlighted how within 2 years they could increase revenue by 38% if they adopted her strategy, which included cutting unnecessary spending, reinvesting into tech-driven solutions, and, most shocking of all, investing in markets across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that Harold had publicly dismissed as risky and irrelevant, but Maya explained that those so-called irrelevant markets were already being targeted by competitors and whoever moved first would dominate, and she had the numbers to prove it, citing case studies of companies who had done the same and tripled their valuations. And as she spoke, board members who had entered the room with smirks now leaned forward, pens scratching furiously against their notepads, some exchanging looks that said, "Why haven't we seen this before?" While Harold grew increasingly agitated, tapping his fingers against the armrest, trying to break her flow with interruptions about market volatility and shareholder risk, but Maya shut him down gracefully each time, countering with data he hadn't even considered, until finally, frustrated, he leaned forward and said, "All right, enough. You've made your point. But don't mistake numbers for leadership. Leadership isn't about spreadsheets. It's about instinct. It's about being tough enough to take risks and smart enough to win, to which Maya responded by leaning in slightly, her voice lowering to a steady, resonant tone that carried across the room. Respectfully, Mr. Caldwell, leadership is about vision. Instinct without knowledge is recklessness, and toughness without direction is tyranny. You asked me to show you how a CEO would run this empire. I just did. The difference is, I see beyond the walls of this room. You don't, and with that, she stood, closing her laptop with finality, and began to leave, but before she reached the door, one of the senior board members, an older man who had served under Harold's father, spoke up for the first time, saying, Maya, before you go, would you be willing to send me a copy of that full proposal? I'd like to review it more closely, his words causing a ripple through the room as others quickly chimed in, asking for access to her materials, even suggesting she return for a follow-up meeting, and Harold, red-faced, tried to reassert himself, barking that the presentation was over and they had wasted enough time, but the damage had already been done, because everyone in that room had seen what real leadership looked like, and it hadn't come from him. And as Maya walked out, her heels clicking like punctuation marks against the polished floor, she knew she had planted a seed that would grow into something much larger than a single meeting, because when a woman like her walked into a room full of men who doubted her and left them speechless, it wasn't just a victory for her. It was the beginning of a revolution in how they would think, act, and choose their leaders going forward, though Harold didn't yet realize that by turning his challenge into a joke, he had written the first lines of his own downfall, and Maya was ready to write the rest.